What's up guys, this is Spiro, and I'll be doing a breakdown of kind of my attempt at recreating the Blackened guitar tone from And Justice for All by Metallica. Hands down, one of the most influential guitar sounds for me and albums. It's one I've been chasing for a real long time. I have a Mark III green stripe simulclass that I have paired with some custom IRs I've made with Voxengo Deconvolver. It's a program you can only run on a PC, but to make it simple, I'm going to include the IR that I made so you can just load it in yourself. Plus URM has a ton of content on making IRs and capturing them. When Neural DSP made, thank God, an emulation of the C++ and ++, it kind of felt like the time to really give it my best shot, and I think this is the closest I've gotten. So much of what makes a guitar tone is often the cabinet and, you know, all the phase wizardry that's going on there, particularly in this band, because, you know, it sounds like on this record they even have like double track guitars on each side, so there's a lot going on there. But I think for the sake of this video, I want to spend more time talking about what makes the Mark series unique and kind of how they would have come across a tone like this with these amps in the first place. It's pretty cool. It kind of feels, it's like once you understand how to dial this amp in, you understand how they would have intuited some of those results. I like to geek out about this stuff, but yeah, let's go ahead and check out the tone. That makes me feel like I'm 9 years old again. That, to me, sounds like And Justice for All, but there's always room to investigate. So, for reference real quick, I'll play the DI. This is my Abasi ME7 with Fluence Tosin signatures in it. I think I also used a Dunlop Flow .88 Tortex. So here's what that sounds like. So that's all downpicked. You know, I'm trying to emulate what James would have been doing. Obviously, playing is going to be a factor in the tone, but I don't know. I think the tone is in the hands thing is big, but like it means something different than like the tone, 2C+, and whatever phase wizardry was going on with that cabin mic setup. Maybe the first thing also to point out is that this plugin by Neural has the Mark II C++ and ++. So, quick overview. The 2C+ was basically a Mark II with some steroids injected into it, you know, a lot more gain on tap. This was the amp that kind of opened the door, opened the gates of hell, so to speak. And then the ++, if you couldn't guess, more gain, but it's kind of it's like a bit of a smoother sounding amp, a bit more compressed, a lot softer. I kind of like to think of the ++ for like that almost like Petrucci-like fluidity, even some like Black Album tones too, as far as rhythm stuff goes. And 2C+ to me is like really transient heavy, really dynamic. To me, it can't be beat for rhythm stuff. But yeah, I mean, Puppets to the Black Album, specifically Puppets and Justice for All, scream 2C+ for me. And the Black Album definitely has like a ++ vibe going on. Based on the lore around Metallica at the time, they had everything in the studio. They had, you know, C++, probably a Mark III. They also had different power amps that they were using to slave the preamps into. For Puppets, it was slaved into a JCM 800 power amp, but for this album, depending on the notes, it was between the 2C+ and ++ as their own amp heads, as well as those preamps slaved into a Mesa Boogie Strategy 400 power amp, which was one of the like super high headroom, high wattage, hi-fi system power amps that Mesa made at the time. The reason that's important is because on the back here, and on a lot of Mesa Boogie Mark Series heads, you have this simulclass Class A switch. Now, putting it in simulclass mode is definitely going to get you closest to that kind of like low-end roar, so to speak. But at the time, if James was using the Strategy 400, that would have been a lot cleaner like across the spectrum. He was likely getting a bit more like lower-end saturation here at the pull deep switch. So because we're using simulclass and we don't have this insanely high headroom power amp to play with that doesn't have any coloration essentially, I have the pull deep in So I'm getting that back here in the graphic EQ section. The graphic EQ low end is going to give you that super like solid state, clean, almost more like Pantera type scoop sound. Whereas using the pull deep is going to give you a bit of that like warmer, almost like rectifier kind of low end. It's like a bit spongier, but you know, you can play with that to taste. So I guess the most important thing to start with would be though, like how unique a Mark series head actually is, and maybe to kind of explain how it would make sense that an amp like this could kind of be the only thing by itself that I'm aware of, especially at the time, that could make a tone like Injustice for All. And the reason for that is, you know, most heavy metal guitar tones, or at least my favorites, are some combination of an overdrive pedal and a high gain amp. My favorite tones are rarely ever using overdrive pedals for gain or level, really. Most, I mean, it might come as a surprise for me, but like, I like using overdrives really just as EQs, just as high pass filters with a bit of a mid-range bump. That's exactly what this amp pretty much does right out of the box, because the whole tone stack from the volume all the way to this mid controller, Master 1, is just an EQ on the DI. So, you know, it's why people say you kind of have to dial in these amps with what look like asinine settings, but it ends up sounding awesome, because all you're really doing when you put bass at 0, mids at 0, and treble at 10, volume at 10, you're really just kind of creating an aggressive high pass filter with a bump somewhere in the upper mids, and it's kind of even like a really low set high shelf. To kind of demonstrate that, right, let's take one of these boys. Make a loop here. If I take this volume and treble control, you can kind of think of these as the thing that are going to tighten up the DI the most. Obviously in accordance with the bass and mid, but watch what happens when I bring the treble down. That's, you know, that's not at all like treble on a tone stack. I mean, it's like you just turned on a Fortin 33 and turned it up a little bit, you know what I mean? What ends up happening is, because to my ears, it feels like whatever high shelf action is going on that treble control, it seems like it's set pretty low in the spectrum. So when you boost that up, it's kind of boosting like the upper mid range as well. So you're just getting this like really aggressive kind of pointed EQ profile on the DI. Playing with the bass down, I mean, it's, again, same kind of thing, right? You're just high passing. So if I turn the bass up, super gross and squishy, and gets really tight. Now, if that's a 2 anemic, you can either play with the pull deep, power amp low end is going to be pretty clean, or even cleaner is going to be here on the 5 band. Right? So you're sending this like super tight and articulate signal into this like super high headroom EQ that it's not going to crumble under any of that. And it reflects it on this record, right? Like, to me, the sound of Justice is this like offensively aggressive pick attack. The important difference here between the C plus and the plus plus is I did this by ear pretty much. Now, of course, it's important to note, right? I said at the beginning of the video, I'm using a custom IR that I made here, which is taking care of most of the EQ and phase, but you'll see how this tone is so much more than an EQ curve. It's funny, people say in metal, like, the most important part of your tone is the cab, and that's true in like a really important sense, but in a very different sense. Like, you know, the non-linearities of like what is going on behind that, that's all here at the amp, and like there's nothing like these Mark series heads for that. And I was able to get closer with the plus than the plus plus, but it was good to try it anyway to kind of demonstrate the differences between the two amps. So here's the same, basically the same take, but just the plus plus instead. Versus. Here how the plus plus is, it's more compressed, it's even a little bit more nasal, but it's still sounds like Justice. And I mean, again, on that record, they used a ton of different stuff. Every song has its own kind of little sub flavor of that kind of thing. Maybe while this feels more like their next record, it can be best taken advantage of for other stuff. I really like hearing it for either like slower rhythm stuff, or like I was saying before, more kind of almost like Periphery-esque fluid lead stuff, or almost like winter sun style lead stuff. It's interesting to hear, right? Because that bark, again, it's a little softer in the upper mid-range. Speaking of the upper mid-range, a thing on both of these amps is, you know, a thing to kind of play between is the top end on the 5-band EQ as well as the top end of the presence control. So for both of these amps, I like to set the presence kind of just around middle, because, you know, there's so many different sources of adding and taking away top end between the 2200 and 6600, all these pull, shift, and bright controls, which we'll talk about in a second, and the presence. I kind of find that just leaving it in the middle is like the most neutral position, and you can kind of play with these pull, shift controls and the graphic EQ to kind of dial in the top end more accurately. But to demonstrate what's going on here with these pull controls, so you have two pull brights, one at the volume and one at the master. The one at the volume is a bit more subtle. Like if I pull this out, it was out already. So if I push this back in and pull it out, not a very big difference. However, this pull shift, you'll notice that when I pull it out, it gets a lot more saturated and a lot softer. So if you're gonna do that, make sure you either pull this back a hair or volume. But to me, I can only imagine, you know, what concoction of guitars and pickups and input level and that would have made that work. But for this, it's a lot tighter when I leave that pushed in. And then pull bright to taste. I mean, a bit like barkier and more in your face. This is, you know, more tucked in. Kind of like that. It's pretty sick. When I was going back and forth, leaving that pushed in felt the most accurate to my ear. The trick with these amps is treat the first 4 knobs more like a tube screamer or a pre-EQ than a traditional tone stack, and think of the 5-band EQ as really the way to shape your sound. The last thing to cover, if I haven't really covered it, is simulclass, pull deep, and what James would have been using at the time, which, as I was saying, he was using a power amp, likely slaved, this preamp of this amp slaved into a Strategy 400 power amp, which had way more headroom and a much flatter response across the spectrum. So he was probably missing a bit of that low, mid, upper bass saturation. So they had pull deep, pulled out to probably get some of that back. We have simulclass already set up on this power amp, which is already giving us a bit of that. So leaving pull deep pushed in, to me, gets pretty damn close. That ends up giving you this, right? Pretty much the last thing in the chain of the plugin would be this EQ section here, and pretty much all I'm doing, as you can see, you know, a bit of that smiley face curve that is kind of synonymous with that record. But yeah, when I was going back and forth between the album tone, I kind of felt like it could use just a touch of that. You could think of it almost like bus processing EQ type stuff, but yeah. So if I take it out, it's going to get a bit more mid-rangey. Verses, right? Pretty dramatic, actually. These increments are actually probably a lot more drastic than they appear. Yeah. So, I mean, in hindsight, I could probably take this off and make some of it back with the graphic, right? Like that to me right there, boosting 80 and cutting 240 a tad, kind of gets me in the ballpark of what I was doing with this. But basic idea, this is a point where you can start to kind of use your ears with the record. As long as, like, to me, how the amp saturation is reacting to the DI, as well as the IR, right? Like the phase and the EQ, the tone, that's the most important stuff to me. General kind of overall footprint shaping, you know, you can play with that to taste. I'm taming a little bit of these resonances down low. So this is actually on the stereo bus, so left and right tone. Right, 167 and a bit more of a broad Q at around 95 hertz. And then in Soothe, I think I'm doing the same thing pretty much. I feel like I got here and it started to sound a lot like the record, and then I think I was just kind of intuiting ways to improve on that tone for maybe a bit more of a practical modern use case. So Maybe if I was going to be totally authentic to the record, I might leave this off. But leaving it on for me, you know, a couple things, right? So this low end resonance. Just take care of a little bit of that. And then this guy, I was cutting a bit more of that upper mid-range. I say cut, but it almost feels like, in this case, it's more of just kind of gently pinning it down. Obviously, the result is that you lose a bit of that, but I was playing with this shelf right here to where if you leave the mid-range detector out, you're just taming these low-end resonances, and as you bring it up, so that right there, I kind of felt like just put it in a really listenable place. Obviously, the remastered version of that record is floating around, so I'm sure there was probably a little bit of stuff, surgical stuff like this going on. But yeah, I mean, that's pretty much the bare bones of that sound. And the last thing I think I did was just a real gentle haircut here on the master. Again, to taste, right? So out versus in. Almost just kind of, you know, dates it a tiny bit, right? Like, it's getting that much closer to what it would have sounded like on tape. That's pretty much justice. Again, the C++ kicks ass, but it's a bit more Black Album to me than Justice. So I hope that was helpful. I suppose one last final note would be that when they recorded this record, they had a couple Aphex EQs in the loop between the preamp and power amp, cutting a ton of mid-range, somewhere between 1 and 2K. And our custom IR is kind of making up for a bit of that. It's why we don't have to go so aggressive on the post 5-band EQ. Obviously, the 750s pulled all the way out, which wasn't atypical at the time for them, but also it's important to remember that, you know, 750, 2200, these aren't a true 750 or 2200. The unique kind of design of the amp and the tolerances and all that, it's going to offset it a bit and going to make it more of a general area, but that pretty much covers how to get these sounds. And at the very least, you're going to come away with some nostalgic tone that fits the footprint of those records, or that record in particular. But yeah, maybe in the future we could do another Metallica album or something. But yeah, hopefully that helps.